There is a cassette tape that was never meant for release. The label on the spine reads, "Not for release" in plain handwriting. And for close to 4 decades, that is exactly where this story stayed. It did not make the evening news. It was never part of any press conference. It did not show up on the highlight reels that ran after the game. It lived instead in the quiet, private corners of professional baseball, in the locker rooms and the dugouts and the long bus rides between cities. Passed between men who understood what it truly cost to compete at the highest level. A story told in whispers by pitchers who knew what it meant to be pulled from a game they were winning. A story that Jack Morris carried with him, quietly and without apology, for the rest of his professional life. Think about the kind of man it takes to hold on to something for that long. To carry a grievance not out of weakness or self-pity, but out of a deep and unshakable belief that a wrong was committed on a very important night. Baseball produces those men more than any other sport. It has a way of burning certain moments into a competitor's memory with a permanence that no amount of time can fully erase. And when the man in question is Jack Morris, when the competitor is someone who built his entire career on the principle of never giving up the ball, the story behind that permanent memory is worth understanding in full. This is the story of why Jack Morris will never forgive Dave Righetti. And before we go any further, I want you to understand something. This is not just a baseball grudge. This is not two guys who did not like each other in a clubhouse. This is a values war. A collision between two completely different ideas of what baseball is, what competition demands, and what it means to be the kind of man you can trust when everything is on the line. That is the real story on this tape, and it starts on a July night in Oakland, California, in the summer of 1987. But first, if you are into deep baseball stories, the kind that go way below the surface and show you what these legends were really about, hit the hype button right now and give this video some hype. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories that the highlight reels never covered. Now let us get into it. Baseball has always been a sport built on a specific kind of pride. Not the kind of pride that gets loud in the locker room or runs its mouth in the press. The quiet kind, the private kind, the kind that a man carries in his chest for 20 years without ever mentioning it to a reporter, because what he feels is too personal and too deep to be reduced to a soundbite. Jack Morris was that kind of man. He was a Detroit Tiger. He was, for an entire decade, the most successful starting pitcher in the entire sport. And his identity, the thing that made him who he was built on a single principle. You finish what you start, you pick up the ball, you take the mound, and you do not come off until the job is done. That was not a preference for Morris. That was a religion. There was nothing comfortable or convenient about the way Morris approached pitching. He was not the kind of starter who counted his pitch count or looked at the manager when things got hard. He was the kind who asked for the ball and then refused to give it back. He pitched deep into games when his arm was tired. He grinded through heat and cold and fatigue because he believed that the ability to grind was the whole point. That separating yourself from everyone else required endurance that most pitchers were not willing to build. Morris had built it over years and years of professional competition, and it became as much a part of who he was as his name. When the 1987 All-Star Game arrived, it was held at the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum, the Midsummer Classic. The one night every summer when the American League and the National League send their best against each other in front of a national audience. Every player there earned their spot. Every player there wanted to perform. But Jack Morris was not just any player. He was the winningest pitcher of the entire 1980s decade. Let that sit for a moment. Not one of the best. Not top 5. The winningest pitcher of the entire decade. A man with more wins than anyone else in the game during that era. If you were going to trust a pitcher with an important moment, this was the guy. The game started with Brett Saberhagen on the mound. Saberhagen threw 3 clean innings. 0 runs allowed, solid and professional. Then Morris came in, entering the game in the 4th inning. And Morris did exactly what the winningest pitcher of the decade was supposed to do. He was sharp. His command was crisp. He navigated the National League lineup and threw 2 clean innings without allowing a single run. The scoreboard read 0-0. The American League was in good shape. Morris was rolling. He was in control. He was doing his job better than anyone could have asked. Then American League manager John McNamara walked to the mound and took the ball away. Not because Morris was struggling, not because Morris was tiring, not because anything was going wrong on that mound. Morris had just thrown 2 dominant innings and shown exactly the command that had made him the best pitcher of the decade. McNamara pulled him anyway, replaced him with a reliever, and started what would become a parade of arms through the bullpen. For Jack Morris, this was not a tactical baseball decision. In the pride-filled world of all-star competition, being removed while you were pitching effectively was a personal message. It was someone in authority telling one of the greatest pitchers in the game that his 2 innings were enough, that he had done his part, that he should go sit down now. For a man whose entire identity was rooted in finishing, this was a wound that did not close quickly. The relievers came in and held the line. Mark Langston threw 2 more clean innings. Dan Plesac came in and got his outs. The score stayed at 0, and the game kept going. 9 innings became 10, 10 became 11, 11 became 12. The American League and the National League could not separate themselves. And with every inning that passed, Morris sat and watched and thought about how none of this needed to happen. He was right there. He was still sharp. He was the proven option. And instead, the American League was cycling through arm after arm in what Morris saw as a broken system, playing itself out in real time. Then came the 13th inning, the highest leverage moment of the entire game. Both teams had been scoreless for 12 full innings. Someone was about to break through. The National League was up to bat with a chance to take the lead, and the American League manager needed his most trusted available arm. The man he chose was Dave Righetti. Righetti inherited a 0-0 tie in the 13th inning and gave up the go-ahead runs. The National League won the game 2-0. The American League, which had pitched clean baseball for 12 innings, could not hold the lead when it finally mattered most. And Jack Morris, who had been sitting on that bench since the 6th inning, watched a man he already had complicated feelings about give up the runs that ended it. Morris's anger was not simply about the outcome of an all-star game. He did not lose any salary over it. It did not affect his team's season, but what it represented was everything. The system had removed a dominant workhorse in favor of a rotating cast of specialists. And when the pressure of 13 innings arrived, and the situation demanded the best option was sitting on the bench while someone else melted under the heat. In Morris's worldview, that was not just bad managing. That was the proof, laid out on a national stage, that the direction the game was heading was fundamentally wrong. Dave Righetti, in Morris's mind, was not just the guy who gave up those runs. He was the symbol of everything Morris believed was dragging baseball away from its soul: the specialist closer, the protected role, the man who comes in fresh for one inning while the workhorse is told his effort is no longer needed. And from that night forward, Morris filed Righetti under a category that would never change: the wrong kind of pitcher at the wrong moment, rewarded by a system that did not understand what real competition demanded. The difference between the way Morris thought about pitching and the way the modern system thought about pitching was not subtle. Morris believed a pitcher's job was to take the mound and not leave it until the manager had no other reasonable choice. He believed that the competitive edge a starter builds by living through a game, by facing a lineup multiple times and learning their patterns and adjusting on the fly, was something that could not be replicated by a fresh arm coming in cold. He believed that durability was a skill, not just a physical trait, that the ability to maintain command and focus deep into a game, through fatigue and pressure and the accumulated wear of innings, was the real measure of a pitcher's value. And he believed that the sport was slowly throwing all of that away in favor of a system that protected specialist arms and shuffled them through games like playing cards. Now here is what made that grudge survive the decades. It was not just the memory of Oakland. The grudge stayed alive because year after year and story after story, everything that came out about Dave Righetti kept confirming exactly what Morris already believed. Every incident, every report, every public conflict and private battle, all of it. And so we are going to walk through the record in order, starting with the most recent and counting all the way back to the stories that first showed the world who Dave Righetti really was under the surface. 7 people, 7 conflicts, 7 clear and documented reasons the grudge never died. The countdown begins now, starting with the most recent and working back to the foundation. Pay attention to the thread that runs through all of them, because that thread is exactly what Morris saw. Number 7, Yusmeiro Petit. When Dave Righetti finished his playing career and moved into coaching, taking over as the pitching coach for the San Francisco Giants, the expectation was that his competitive fire would soften, that the emotional edge that defined his playing days would settle into patience and wisdom. Instead, Righetti brought the same rigidity that had defined him as a player directly into his coaching role. Yusmeiro Petit was one of the pitchers who felt it most. Petit was a pitcher with genuine natural talent. He had his own feel for his delivery, his own mechanics that worked for his body, his own way of repeating his arm path and finding his release point. But under Righetti, that natural approach was not good enough. Righetti had a specific vision for how a pitcher should move, where the arm should be, what the release point should look like. And he pushed that vision onto every pitcher in his care, regardless of whether the pitcher's individual body could execute it comfortably or safely. Petit described feeling completely micromanaged. He talked about a period of deep frustration where he felt like his natural ability was being buried under a formulaic approach that left no room for his own instincts, his own feel, or his own understanding of what worked for him. The mechanical changes that Righetti demanded were not gentle adjustments. They were full overhauls, delivered with the insistence that his way was the only way. There is a real physical reason why this kind of coaching can be dangerous. Every pitcher's arm is different. The way a pitcher releases the ball creates specific stress on the ligaments in the elbow, particularly on a ligament called the UCL. When you force a pitcher to change that release point unnaturally, to bend their mechanics to a different shape than what their body knows, you can actually increase the stress on those ligaments beyond what the anatomy is built to handle. Righetti's one-size-fits-all coaching approach did not account for individual bodies. It demanded that every pitcher look the same, and that rigid insistence created not just emotional friction, but physical risk. Pettit eventually found some footing under Righetti and went on to have a productive career. But the road there was long and painful, and it sent a message to every other arm in that Giants organization. To survive under Righetti, you had to give up your own instincts and hand them over to his system. You had to follow his mandates or you were going to struggle. That my way or the highway approach was not a new feature. It was a pattern that ran through Righetti's entire career. Number 6. Jonathan Sanchez. Jonathan Sanchez was a pitcher of genuine talent. The arm was there. The stuff was there. The stuff was actually elite on his best days. But Sanchez battled with focus and mental consistency, the kinds of issues that coaches are supposed to help a player work through. The right way to handle that situation is internally. You have the hard conversations behind closed doors. You protect your player from outside criticism while you push him to grow in private. You keep it inside the building. Righetti did the exact opposite. He went to the media. He publicly called out Sanchez for a lack of focus, turning what should have been a private coaching challenge into a public spectacle. The back and forth between coach and player spilled out into newspapers and press conferences, and eventually made Sanchez's position in the organization completely untenable. The relationship was broken beyond repair. Sanchez was shown the door. Sanchez felt that what Righetti called tough love was actually something else entirely. He felt scapegoated. He felt like he was being used as a public example rather than genuinely coached toward improvement. And the detail that stings the most is this. Righetti spent years as a Yankee under George Steinbrenner, a man who was infamous for using the press as a weapon against his own players. Righetti had been on the receiving end of that culture. He had lived through it, and when he became the man in authority, he did the same thing he once claimed to despise. The unwritten rule in professional sports is simple. You handle your business inside the building. You do not embarrass your own player to make a point to the media. When you break that rule, you break trust. And once trust is broken in a professional environment, it rarely comes back. Number 5. Barry Bonds. Righetti spent 18 years as the pitching coach for the San Francisco Giants. For a large portion of that time, Barry Bonds was the most dominant and most complicated figure in that clubhouse. The relationship between Righetti and Bonds was described by those close to the situation as one of professional distance. Cold, functional, but barely warm. Bonds was the kind of player who did not keep his frustrations quiet. When runs were being given up, when a lead was not being protected, Bonds made his feelings known. He would criticize the pitching staff directly and openly. Righetti, who was fiercely protective of his pitchers, pushed back whenever Bonds pushed forward. The loyalty Righetti showed his staff was real, but the way that loyalty played out in practice had a serious side effect. The pitching staff and the offense stopped operating as one team. They became two separate units moving in parallel, but never really together. The collaborative spirit that championship teams run on was missing. Instead of a leader who could navigate a difficult personality like Bonds and bring two sides of a roster together, Righetti dug in. He protected his turf, he held his ground, and the clubhouse fractured along the fault lines that created. A great coach reads the room and adjusts. A great leader knows when standing firm serves the team and when it tears it apart. The Bonds situation showed that Righetti consistently chose his own defensiveness over the health of the broader group around him. That inability to adapt to complex personalities was a thread that wove through his entire career. Number 4. Steve Carlton. When Steve Carlton arrived with the Giants late in his Hall of Fame career, he brought with him one of the most accomplished pitching resumes in the history of the game. 4 Cy Young Awards. Over 300 wins, decades of experience developing and refining the methods that had made him elite. Carlton believed deeply in unconventional training, in strength and flexibility work that was uniquely his own, built through years of experimentation and success. Righetti looked at Carlton and saw someone who needed to be adjusted. He suggested changes to Carlton's delivery. He proposed modifications to Carlton's training regimen. Carlton dismissed those suggestions, dismissed them with the kind of disdain that a legend reserves for someone who does not fully understand the room they have walked into. Here is what a smart coach does in that situation. You read the person, you recognize that you are dealing with a 4-time Cy Young winner who has been pitching professionally for longer than some coaches have been alive. You show some deference, you build trust. You have a conversation as equals before you start handing down mechanical mandates. You understand that this man knows his body, and that the methods that earned him 4 Cy Young Awards were probably not the problem. Righetti did not do any of that. He pushed his adjustments. Carlton pushed back. The relationship went nowhere. It was another example of a recurring failure in Righetti's career, a fundamental inability to adapt his approach to the individual in front of him. He had one way of doing things and he applied it regardless of context. For a world-class competitor like Carlton, that was an immediate deal breaker. Number 3. Butch Wenger. In baseball, there is no partnership more important than the one between a pitcher and his catcher. Everything runs through that relationship. The catcher reads the game, reads the hitter, processes the scouting report, factors in the count and the situation, and puts down fingers that guide the pitcher through each at-bat. The pitcher trusts those fingers. The catcher trusts the pitcher to execute. That trust is not optional. It is the foundation of every successful pitching performance. Butch Wenger was a seasoned professional catcher who took genuine pride in managing a pitching staff. He was good at his job. He understood hitters and he understood how to position pitchers for success. During the period when he was the primary catcher for the Yankees, Righetti was one of the arms he was asked to guide. Righetti ignored him constantly. He shook off Wenger's signs and went with his own pitch selection, regardless of what the scouting report said, regardless of what Wenger was reading from behind the plate, regardless of what the situation called for. Wenger found Righetti's stubbornness to be a real hindrance to the team's ability to win games. The tension between them was not kept private. There were heated mound visits that played out in front of thousands of fans. Two men who were supposed to be working together were visibly at war in the middle of a real game. And off the field, Righetti's internal struggles ran even deeper. He had a habit of hiding in the clubhouse before his starts, avoiding the coaching staff. He was so overwhelmed by the fear of failure, so consumed by the worry that his poor performances might result in his coaches getting fired, that he could not sleep at night. He described pacing his apartment at 4 in the morning, unable to rest, running worst-case scenarios through his head instead of trusting himself and preparing for the competition ahead. For Jack Morris, hearing any part of this story was more than confirmation. It was the exact opposite of everything he believed a pitcher should be. You do not hide from your coaches. You do not pace the floors at 4 in the morning, letting fear eat your mind alive. You show up, you compete, you trust the people around you, and you trust yourself. Righetti's relationship with Wenger was, in Morris's eyes, proof of exactly the kind of fragile, self-centered competitor that the modern game was elevating above men who deserved it more. Number 2. Wade Boggs. July 4th, 1983. Dave Righetti is on the mound at Yankee Stadium. The temperature outside is 94 degrees, the kind of summer heat that wraps around a pitcher like a wet blanket. Righetti has been out there all afternoon fighting through it. His pitch count climbs past 100, past 110, past 120. He is working through the Boston Red Sox lineup, and he is doing something that almost never happens at the major league level. He is not allowed a single hit. He is throwing a no-hitter. By the 9th inning, the entire stadium is standing, 50,000 people holding their breath. Righetti has done it through 8, 1 more inning, 3 more outs, and now he has to face Wade Boggs, one of the greatest contact hitters in the history of the game. A man who had an almost supernatural ability to get the bat on the ball in any situation, who worked counts with discipline and patience, whose eye at the plate was considered among the very best of his era. This is the final at-bat. This is the last hurdle between Righetti and history. And the score is 4-0. Boston was already losing badly. The no-hitter was 1 out away from being complete. This was a moment that called for poise. Trust your defense, trust your command. Finish the job cleanly with respect for the craft and for the man standing at the plate. Instead, Righetti came at Boggs with a series of high, tight fastballs. Aggressive, personal, an approach that, given the score and the context, Boggs later felt crossed a line. Not because any of the pitches were illegal, but because the aggression felt unnecessary in a game that was already won. It felt to Boggs like Righetti was making the final out about himself, about his own personal glory, about dominating rather than simply finishing. It felt like a statement rather than a pitch. The competitive back and forth between Boggs and Righetti continued for years afterward. The perception that formed around that final at-bat was that Righetti had allowed his own ego and his own fear to drive him into treating a lopsided final out like a personal battle. That is precisely what the code in baseball is designed to prevent. You compete, you fight hard. But when the game is decided and you have one man between you and history, you trust your ability, you trust your defense, and you close it out with the mutual respect the game is built on. The conditions around that no-hitter give some context to what was happening inside Righetti that afternoon. 94 degrees of relentless heat, 132 pitches thrown through it. Righetti later described himself as being in what he called a limp noodle state from the combination of exhaustion and heat. He was running on adrenaline and on fear. Fear of what Steinbrenner would think if he failed. Fear of losing the moment. Those fears drove him past the boundaries of the code, and the competitive friction that followed lasted for years. Morris viewed the no-hitter not as a masterclass, but as a lucky achievement by a pitcher who lacked the mental discipline to respect the game's traditions even in his greatest moment. Number 1. Don Mattingly. Of all the stories that define who Dave Righetti really was behind the surface, the ones that came from Don Mattingly carry the most weight. Mattingly shared a dugout with Righetti in New York for years. He saw the real version of Dave Righetti every single day, not the polished California cool image that Righetti could project from a comfortable distance. The actual, unfiltered, volatile competitor who lived just underneath that surface. Mattingly was one of the most professional and respected players of his era, a man known for doing things right and holding himself to a standard that most athletes could only aim for. When a player like that looks back on a teammate and recalls two stories that paint an unflattering picture, you pay attention to what he is telling you. The first story happens in spring training, an exhibition game, preseason baseball where no standings points are on the line, where the whole point is to get reps, shake the rust off, and build toward the season ahead. An opposing player stepped into the batter's box and bunted for a base hit against Righetti. In the world of 1980s baseball, bunting for a hit against a power pitcher was considered a form of disrespect. Instead of standing in and competing power against power, the hitter was sidestepping the real confrontation and taking the cheap route to get on base. To Righetti, that was an insult that demanded a response. So the very next time that player came to the plate, Righetti hit him with a pitch. On the first delivery, in a spring training game that did not count for anything. The Yankee dugout was not happy. Even Righetti's own teammates questioned the wisdom of starting something in a game that had no meaning. The risk of injury, of a brawl, of creating real problems in a non-consequential game was obvious to everyone around him. But Righetti did not weigh those things. He felt disrespected, and the response was immediate and physical. That snake-like speed to retaliate was a defining character trait that Morris found deeply distasteful. Morris operated on professional stoicism. You handle your emotions internally. You let the results of your pitching do the talking. You do not throw at a man in an exhibition game because he had the nerve to bunt. The calculation of consequences, the read of the room, the understanding of when to act and when to absorb, those things were absent in Righetti's response. He reacted from pure impulse. The second Mattingly story happens at Exhibition Stadium in Toronto. The Yankees are in the middle of a real game. Righetti is on the mound. At some point, manager Lou Piniella makes the call to take him out. He comes to get the ball, and Dave Righetti, standing behind the pitcher's mound, on a professional baseball field with thousands of fans in the seats and his teammates watching, throws the baseball over the right field wall. Not to a fielder, not toward the dugout. Over the wall, out of the park, gone. Let that image sit for a moment. A major league pitcher in a game that counts throwing a baseball over a stadium wall in front of the crowd because he was angry about being substituted. That was not passion. That was not fire. That was a man who had completely lost control of himself in a professional setting. The contrast to the persona Morris believed an elite pitcher needed to maintain could not have been more complete. Morris believed the very best pitchers had ice water in their veins, that they kept their emotions tight and controlled no matter what the situation demanded. What Righetti showed in Toronto was the opposite of all of that. It was a public tantrum from a grown professional who could not handle being told his night was done. And for Morris, it was one more piece of evidence in a case he had already closed. Now step back and look at all 7 of these stories together. Yus Mero Petit squeezed under rigid mechanical mandates until his natural ability felt buried. Jonathan Sanchez, embarrassed publicly instead of coached privately, pushed out of an organization by the man who was supposed to develop him. Barry Bonds, creating a divided clubhouse by refusing to navigate a difficult but important personality. Steve Carlton, a 4-time Cy Young winner, pushed away by a coach who could not read the room. Butch Winnegar, fighting visible mound battles with a pitcher who refused to trust his catcher. Wade Boggs, chirping for years over a final at-bat in a game that was already decided. Don Mattingly, watching his teammate throw a baseball over a stadium wall and deliberately plunk a hitter in an exhibition game. 7 stories. 7 different people. 7 moments spread across decades and across every level of the game, from a spring training field in the preseason to the pitching coach's office in San Francisco. And every single one of them arrives at the same place. A competitor who operated almost entirely on impulse and reaction. A man who could not bend toward other people, could not read what was needed in the room, and could not separate his own ego from the moment directly in front of him. Each story on its own might look like an isolated incident. Something that happens in the heat of competition. Something understandable, something forgivable, but laid out together, one after the other. Spanning from his days as a young Yankee pitcher all the way through his final years as a coaching veteran, they stop looking like isolated incidents. They start looking like a character. They start looking like a pattern, and patterns do not lie. That is the picture that made the 1987 All-Star Game so permanent inside Jack Morris. Morris had pitched 2 dominant innings in Oakland. He was sharp, he was ready, he was the proven option. And when the game stretched into a 13-inning battle that demanded a real workhorse mentality, the manager looked to a system of specialists rather than the man who was built for exactly that kind of grind. The final arm trusted with the biggest moment was Dave Righetti. Righetti gave up the go-ahead runs. The National League won 2-0. For Morris, that night was not just a loss. It was a verdict. Two very different visions of baseball had crashed into each other on the biggest summer stage in the sport, and the wrong one had been chosen. The workhorse was benched after 2 clean innings. The specialist got the ball in the 13th. The game was lost because the men making decisions believed in a system that Morris had already seen through. And the man who was trusted with the highest leverage moment was someone whose entire career from that night forward kept proving Morris right again and again with each new story that surfaced. The grudge never softened because the evidence never stopped arriving. Every new Righetti story confirmed what Morris had already concluded in Oakland. Every public controversy, every thrown baseball, every stifled young pitcher added another layer to a judgment that had been made in real time and never needed to be revised. Morris did not hold the grudge out of pettiness. He held it because, by every account and every story that followed, he had been right. The original feeling on that July night in Oakland was not paranoia or wounded pride. It was an accurate read of a man, a system, and a moment that would repeat itself in different forms for the next several decades. And that is what makes this story about more than two men who disagreed. Baseball in the 1980s and through the 1990s was changing in ways that could not be stopped. The workhorse starter was slowly becoming a relic. Complete games were disappearing. Pitch counts were starting to matter. Specialists were being defined and elevated and protected by their roles. The closer was becoming a celebrity. The old workhorse mentality was being replaced by a data-driven, role-specific approach that valued management of arms over the warrior pride of finishing what you started. Morris hated that change. And Righetti was not just a rival pitcher who annoyed him. Righetti was a human symbol of that change. He was what the new game looked like in person. The closer who was protected by his role, who got to come in fresh while the starter was told to sit down, who was designed to thrive in short bursts rather than long grinds. The fact that Righetti's personality matched the worst version Morris had imagined, volatile and fragile and self-centered, and impossible to coach or collaborate with, made him the perfect permanent target for everything Morris could not accept about the direction the sport was going. This is the part of the story worth sitting with, not the grudge itself, because grudges are not something to celebrate or copy, but the passion beneath it. The intensity, the refusal to let go of a set of values that had defined an entire era of the sport. Jack Morris was not simply stubborn. He was a man who believed in something deeply, who had built his whole identity around those beliefs, and who watched a system he trusted turn its back on him in a very public moment and hand the ball to someone who represented everything he stood against. That kind of passion is inseparable from greatness. The men who compete at the highest level, the ones who leave their fingerprints on the sport long after they are done playing, are almost always carrying something like this inside them. A refusal to accept something that violated their deepest values. An inability to move on from the moment that revealed what the world really thought of what they stood for. Morris channeled all of that into every start he made after Oakland, into every inning he pushed through when his body was tired, into every complete game he fought to finish, because he refused to be the guy who handed the ball to the bullpen. Baseball needed both kinds of players to evolve into what it became. The game is genuinely richer for having elite closers, for building out a specialist culture that extended careers and produced incredible moments. The data-driven approach that followed the workhorse era has produced real benefits that cannot be dismissed. And Dave Righetti was a real pitcher. His 4th of July no-hitter is one of the most memorable pitching performances in Yankee history. His 18 years as a Giants pitching coach is not a small thing. But the intensity that Jack Morris brought, that stubborn and uncompromising commitment to finishing the job, that warrior refusal to be told to sit down when he was still rolling and still capable, those things have permanent value in the sport. They always will. The fire that burns in a competitor who truly believes in what he does, the kind of fire that keeps a memory alive for decades, not out of bitterness, but out of principle. That fire is what great baseball is made of. It is what makes the sport feel alive. It is what separates athletes from competitors and competitors from legends. Every generation of baseball produces men who carry something like what Morris carried. The details change. The names change. The situations are never exactly the same. But the core of it, the willingness to hold a standard so tightly that a single night in Oakland can define a lifetime of feeling, that is the thread that connects every great competitor the game has ever seen. The tape was never meant for release, but the story was always there, locked inside the memory of a workhorse who was told to sit down on a July night in Oakland and never forgot the moment the wrong man was given his ball.